And take it away, Greg.
Hey, thanks, Gary. Hope everybody can hear me. All right. Um, Today I want to give an kind of an update of the work we've been doing on white sharks off the coast of Massachusetts, but kind of show the trajectory of the research since we started and put it in a little bit of a historical perspective. I think last time I gave one of these seminars, it was pretty much focused on our most recent behavioral work, and I will touch on that as well. But I want to, kind of start at square one and how we got to where we are today. Um, Let me see if these will advance. There we go. I think most of us, or many of us, identify with white sharks through this film. And what's really quite remarkable is at the time when this film was made in 1975, and we're on the 50th anniversary of this film. We knew very little about white sharks, virtually nothing really about white sharks in the Atlantic Ocean. White sharks were really just incidentally captured by fishermen from time to time, brought to the docks and showcased like this old photo from the 30s here. But it was largely considered to be a rare event species, one that scientists could not predictably go out and find, and one that therefore we could not study. So although Jaws portrayed this evil menace living off Cape Cod that was out to consume human beings, we really knew nothing about the biology of this species in this part of the world. The first person to really have an opportunity to get some insights into the behavior of white sharks in the Western North Atlantic was a scientist by the name of Frank Carey from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He's pictured here on the upper left with his brother to his right on a research cruise I was with him many, many, many years ago. Frank was kind of a pioneer in acoustic tracking, acoustic technology, and physiology with big fish. And he had been building tags in his lab in Woods Hole. And I would argue that probably Frank was the real Matt Hooper in the film and back in those days. Those tags he would use to try to study the physiology of these animals and how these animals interact with their environment, doing short-term acoustic tracks. And because, nowadays we're pretty lucky to be able to go buy these tags off the shelf from various manufacturers. Frank was building these in his lab, and he had been tracking bluefin tuna and swordfish. And he got word from a colleague of his by the name of Jack Casey that white sharks were south of Montauk Point feeding on a dead whale. And so he took one of his tags out there with Jack Casey, who was working at the National Marine Fisheries Service, and he placed one of his home-built acoustic transmitters into one of the white sharks feeding on a dead whale. And this is actually a photo of Frank on the pulpit of the boat, back in 1979. And he produced this paper in 1982, a couple of years later, called Temperature and Activities of the White Shark. He published it in Copia, the number of co-authors that were out with him that day. And he basically followed that shark, following the acoustic ping of that animal over the course of 3 days. And these are a couple figures from that paper. The upper right shows the horizontal movements of that shark, and the lower shows the vertical movements because he built a transducer, pressure transducer into that acoustic transmitter. So these are the first glimpse, not only in the behavior of white sharks in the Atlantic Ocean, but also the behavior of white sharks anywhere in the world. Nobody had ever done this before, so it was kind of a landmark paper. And what was really neat about the paper is it didn't include a whole lot of statistics and modeling, but it did, allow Frank to kind of talk about, white shark behavior in the Atlantic Ocean and why we didn't know much about this species in this part of the world. And he talks about the fact that, seal populations had been driven to the brink of extinction, at the time, and protections had not been put in place until 1972. And so there wasn't this aggregating force that drew white sharks to any specific aggregation site. And I think many of you know where I'm going with this. And as a result, white sharks were somewhat scattered over the Western North Atlantic, as evidenced by this particular, 3-day glimpse into the behavior of this animal largely remaining offshore, occasionally visiting the bottom. You could see in the vertical movements there, spending a lot of time in the thermocline, and likely feeding on benthic demersal fishes, schooling fishes near the surface, and looking for dead whale carcasses. And so, I thought it was pretty interesting that this was the only acoustic track up until we started our work many, many, many years later. This was the brief glimpse into the biology of this animal, and it happened in 1979. In 1985, I was working at the National Marine Fisheries Service lab in Narragansett for the cooperative shark tagging program. Here's an old photo of me next to Jack Casey, the colleague of Frank Carey, who was running the cooperative shark tagging program. And he and Wes Pratt, who I was also working with at that time, put together a synopsis of everything we knew about white shark distribution, and produced all these data points basically by mining fisheries interaction records and literature, news reports, et cetera, et cetera. And they came up with over 600 dots. Actually, they came up with close to 400 dots, and we updated this with Toby Curtis, who works over at NIMS now, back in 2014. And this is basically the historical distribution of the white shark, with records going back to the early 1800s. And as you can see, historically, the shark is thought to be largely a coastal species associated with the continental shelf, distributed from the eastern Gulf of Mexico all the way along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. up to Newfoundland. So, the distribution of white sharks in northern latitudes is historically documented. So a lot of times when I'm fielding media calls these days, there's this push for white sharks being here because of climate change, and we don't see a lot of evidence of that as of yet. But this persisted as basically what we knew about the distribution of these animals in this part of the world. And, it's also a testament to the fact that it's a rare species. 600 data points over time is not a lot. And so, you could also get a sense that learning about this species would be a significant challenge, because there's no easy way to go out and find them. A lot of these green dots were largely fisheries interactions, and some of them were animals that were brought to the dock. So working at Jack's lab, we would get access to some of these specimens. And traditional fisheries biology is largely driven by necropsies, and we were doing quite a bit of them in those days. And Jack had been doing quite a bit of necropsies on sharks over the years, and I continued to do that up until, to where I am today. And so here's a really small white shark that was caught by a gill netter and shipped to Jack's lab that was dissected. And we even went out and saw a couple of the larger specimens that were brought in which necropsies were conducted. For those of you who pay attention to the news, and I don't blame you if you don't, we did have a white shark wash ashore, strand itself up in Orleans in a couple of months ago in October. So we did do a necropsy on it. And I'm going to show you what that necropsy looks like, because you can get a sense of what we do. But it's basically tissue sampling. And as is the case with traditional fisheries biology, some of the things we do is quite obvious. You look in the stomach, see what the animal's eating. In the case of sharks, we like to take a section of the backbone to look at rings, vertebral banding patterns, to get a sense of age and longevity, growth rates, et cetera. So, look at reproductive system, male, female, mature, immature, size of maturity, those kinds of things. So much of what we knew about the white shark in the Atlantic Ocean largely came from those little green dots that were landed and necropsied. It gave us a way to start to examine various aspects of their natural history. But a dead shark doesn't tell you much about its behavior and movement ecology. And to give an example of how we've been able to take those samples and turn them into meaningful science, Lisa Natanson and I, a bunch of years ago, now 10 years ago, looked at all the vertebrae that had been collected by Jack's program and others dating back to the early 1960s to generate a growth curve. And we worked closely with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution to look at bomb carbon as well to get a sense of longevity and growth rates in these animals. And it turns out that the white shark is one of the longest lived sharks living in excess of 70 years with a relatively very slow growth rate and late ages at maturity, which in the mid-20s for males and even early 30s for females. And so it's a long-lived, slow-growing species that when hit with exploitation will knock its population down fairly quickly. But again, this is wonderful science, but doesn't give us a sense about the biology, behavior, migration, movement ecology of the animals. And just to kind of give you a sense of how rare the species it was in those days, we used to have the Massachusetts Shark Tournament program that I ran for years until shark tournaments went away in Massachusetts. So this is a look at the data we collected from 1987 to 2010, which is 24,000, almost 25,000 sharks that were reported to us through this program as encountered by shark tournament participants over those years. And you can see there's no white sharks listed here. You know, the bulk of the sharks caught by these fishermen were blue sharks, followed by makos, and then a smattering of other species. So it gives you a sense of how rare the white shark was up until recently, you know, in our waters. And then there's a famous story of 2004, and many of the people working for some of the people working for the agency still, like Dan, remember this event when a white shark swam into an estuary in the Elizabeth Islands. And it was kind of it's a long story, and I can do an entire talk on this. I could probably do a whole book on this particular event, and I probably will at some point. But this is a white shark that swam into this estuary at Noshawn Island, Elizabeth Islands, southwest of Woods Hole, and remained for 2 weeks. And I show it here because it was somewhat of a wake-up call for us, and in the fact that yes, white sharks do occur in New England. It's historical. We have these records of it, and don't forget that it is a species that we are likely to encounter. I should say unlikely to encounter, but they do occur here. And I remember after this 2-week-long ordeal, which I'll talk about it, individually if you guys want to reach out to me about it or talk to Dan about it. There's a few others around that were here. Is that this shark was starting to show up in larger numbers starting in the early 2000s. And I'll remember when we put that satellite tag on the shark, and you see the shark swim by with the pop-up satellite tag, and I was so excited about that. And of course, the tag came off right after we got the shark out of the pond. I was pretty bummed out, pretty frustrated. And I remember our current director, Dan McKiernan, at the time was not our director, but he said to me, Greg, I got a feeling we're going to see more white sharks. And he was absolutely right. And the evidence we were getting at the same time was coming from the Cape Cod Stranding Network, which is now IFAW. And that's in the shape of big seals like these gray seals here, shown here, with big bite marks in them. We started seeing this in greater frequency. We're getting in these reports fairly consistently from the Stranding Network. And it was kind of in addition to the shark in the salt pond, another, wake-up call that the white sharks were coming back in response to a growing gray seal population, and specifically along the outer Cape. And so this was really our first indications that this species was returning in big numbers in response to this forage base that was coming back, not only to Cape Cod, but throughout the Gulf of Maine and the Canadian Maritimes. And so the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, we tend to think of it as leading to the protection of whales, dolphins, and porpoises, but it did include seals as sea lions as well. So, seal populations, which by some estimates were reduced to extremely low levels by the early 70s, we're now responding to decades of protection and showing up in big numbers. And now it's not unusual to see seals around Cape Cod and throughout the Gulf of Maine. And the white sharks are responding to this. We started doing a little bit of modeling, looking at various databases, and long-term historical databases were virtually absent in terms of standardized surveys for white sharks. I already showed you that our tournament fishermen were not encountering them, but we did have these sightings databases. And so in 2012, we looked specifically at Cape Cod, and the number of these dead seals on the beach, in addition to white shark sightings being reported to us. And we did some, modeling. We had Steve Correa, who used to be with the agency, working with us on this. And we showed that, through the early 2000s, we were into the, 2005 plus, we're starting to see an increase in white sharks locally. Toby Curtis, in the paper we published in 2014, did the same thing, but looking at the entire historical sightings database, and came up with a similar trend in recent years with white sharks coming back. You can see that in the lower panel here. What's interesting is what this time series shows is that the white shark population was fairly stable through the 50s, 60s, 70s, until we get into the late 70s, mid to late 70s, and we see some declines that occurred through into the 80s. They remained low through the 90s, and we see a response of the population as we get into the early 2000s, which kind of is very similar to what we saw locally. And so by all indications, and these are not the most robust data sets or most reliable, but by all indications, we are starting to see the recovery of the white shark population as well. And so now let's fast forward a bunch of years, and these are the kinds of densities we're seeing locally of the gray seal population. And I say this far too often, it's kind of goofy, but if you show me a restaurant that looks like that, I'm going to show you the customers that look like this. And so now we've got unfolding along the Outer Cape in particular, and we'll talk about this shortly, white sharks feeding on gray seals. And this is, by all accounts, the restoration of a healthy ecosystem. You want seals, you want the mesopredators out there, and you want the predators who are feeding on seals. And this is probably what we had, hundreds of years ago, prior to us removing seal populations. What we did not count on, and certainly is not the positive aspect of this whole scenario, is the overlap of this predator-prey, natural predator-prey relationship with human activities. And I think if you told me 20 years ago I'd be concerned about shark attack, I would have said that's crazy. Why would I be concerned about shark attack? But now we are. We've had a number of interactions, which I'll talk about shortly, because of the overlap of white sharks with their natural prey and human activities. Over the course of time, Cape Cod has morphed from an agricultural community to one highly dependent on tourism, tourist-based economy. And so, a lot of that tourism is driven by the beautiful beaches and the water activities that are associated with Cape Cod. And so now we've got a top predator feeding on seals, overlapping with these water activities, and the potential for negative interactions has gone up. It's still improbable, but it has gone up. And so let's talk about the research that we've started doing back in 2009, and the trajectory of that research up until last year. And so it's involved a number of technologies that did not exist when I was, working at Jack Casey's program back in the early 80s, except for what Frank was building in his basement over at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. But now satellite link tags are pervasive throughout the research we're doing and others are doing. Acoustic telemetry is used by researchers all over the world on thousands of species of marine animals. We've got broad scale arrays set up. We have live receivers that report the detection of sharks. We have fine scale arrays. I'll touch on those. And now we've got tags that can actually show us and tell us what these animals are doing second to second. And of course, drone technology, both underwater drones, which we've used to track white sharks, to aerial drones, have been very useful for us studying behavior. And so, the scale of our research has changed, over the years. We at first were very much interested in, the big picture relative to white sharks in the Western North Atlantic. So we used quite a bit of satellite linked technology. But as time gone on, we've changed the scale and the resolution of our research, where we're now far more interested in fine scale behavior. But we'll walk through these processes. As you can imagine, funding for shark research comes from a few sources. And over the course of my career, I've had to reach outside the agency for much of the work I've done on many of the species we've studied over my 37-plus-year career. In the case of white sharks, I was stealing largely at first, from grants I had written to study basking sharks and other species. And the director at the time was also helping me out a little bit with some funding. But it was clear to me that long-term sustainability of our research was going to be contingent on external sources. And so, yeah, we reached out to Mass Environmental Trust and others. But the real source of funding for us over the last 13, 14 years has been through the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, which was established by this woman here, Cynthia Wigren, back in 2012. As a result of a conversation I had with her in my office, because she wanted to help out. And we simply did not have the funding. And I said to her, well, if you want to help out, you could help us generate money to get this research done. The white shark work was just kicking off. And the tags we were using are very expensive. You know, the satellite link technology ranges from $2,000 to $4,000 per tag. And the acoustic technology is roughly $400 to $500 per tag, not to mention the deployment of $2,500 receivers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, this kind of research, all research requires funding. So Cynthia was great in stepping up, starting the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, and has really had an incredible growth trajectory over the last 12 years, 13 years. And so they've now got the Shark Center in Chatham, which showcases, you know, the biology of white sharks and our research. And then in 2014, I started working with Megan Winton. She started at the school from SMAST downstairs, working on her PhD, working with us. And then she was then picked up by the Conservancy as their full-time staff scientist. So much of what you're about to see is funded by the Conservancy, in addition to some help from the legislature over the years, depending on white shark activity. I think most of you have seen what our tagging technique looks like. This is a video shot by Carlos Guana, who has a famous YouTube channel called The Malibu Artist. He videotapes white sharks all over the world using his aerial drone. This is us placing an acoustic tag on a free-swimming white shark. So the goal, because we're working so close to swimming beaches of Cape Cod, is to be as least invasive as possible when we tag these fish. We don't want to capture them. We don't want to haul them through the water, tie them up to the side of the boat, lift them out of the water, any of those things. You know, we're working too close to popular swimming beaches. And so the idea of tagging a free swimming fish is the most efficient and least invasive way to do that. And using a standard technique of a very small intramuscular dart inserted at the base of the dorsal fin. And these sharks are located using a spotter pilot from the air. So let's walk through the various tags. I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on each of these techniques, but you'll see ultimately what we've learned over the years. The satellite link technology, for the most part, for us comes in two shapes. The real-time spot tag, which when the shark is at the surface will transmit to a satellite and let us know where that animal is. It works well if the shark comes up, but the tag needs to be bolted to the top of the dorsal fin. And so this was a technique we first used with OSearch in 2012 and 2013 when we tagged 4 sharks off Cape Cod. But now we're using it with a fisherman out of South Carolina, where we've tagged 20+ white sharks, putting these satellite tags at on their dorsal fins. And so the example you see on the right side of this screen is one of these sharks that was tagged off South Carolina, and it migrated around the Florida Keys into the Gulf of Mexico and as far as the Mexican border before coming back up here the following spring. Brief visit to Cape Cod before moving on to Nova Scotia and around into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So it gives you a really great sense of what these tags can do in terms of broad scale movements. The tag you see pictured in the upper left is what we call a pop-up satellite tag. And that tag will record depth, temperature, and light levels every 10 seconds. And then at a time programmed by us, will detach from the shark, float to the surface. You can deploy these for up to a year. The advantage to these tags is that the shark doesn't have to come to the surface for you to get data. The tag will jettison from the shark, float to the surface, transmit the data, and we can recreate what the shark did in three-dimensional space. The spot tag doesn't give you depth information. The PSAT tag does. And so a good example, and I showed this the other day at our staff meeting. I think this is the video that worked, but a good example of how we can look at the tracks of satellite link tags over the course of time for individuals is demonstrated here. And we can relate that, of course, to the environment. So we can really start to look at the ecology of these animals over big spatial scales. This video shows the movements of our tagged sharks off Cape Cod as they relate to the movements of younger white sharks tagged by Toby Curtis off of Long Island. So you can see how you could start to put together the migratory patterns of these animals, you know, over time using this technology. By far, the tag we use most commonly, particularly as we start to focus more on finer scale movements, is acoustic technology. And as many of you know, the agency has been using these acoustic tags, acoustic transmitters, on a variety of species over the course of the last decade or so. And of course, that includes white sharks. And for those of you who don't know how the technology works, it's fairly straightforward. Same kind of acoustic transmitters built by Frank Carey. His tag lasted about 3 days. These transmitters now last upwards of 9 to 10 years. And the tags are detected by acoustic receivers that we've placed throughout Massachusetts waters. And I want to call out here, you know, our Bill Hoffman and his crew for being so instrumental in helping us get these acoustic receivers out, which are pictured here as little yellow dots. And you can see all my hypothetically tagged white sharks that swim within the range of one of these acoustic receivers, which could be anywhere between 100 meters up to 500 meters. We generally get 300 to 500 meters on the outer Cape. The receiver will detect the presence of that animal, decode who that animal is. So each one of those transmitters is individually coded to an individual, and do a timestamp. And then what we do is we'll go out, and we being Bill and his crew, for the most part, haul those receivers in, and we'll be able to download and start to answer some of the most basic questions about when these animals arrive, where they spend their time, and when they leave. So we can look at the seasonality, and we can look at hotspots for white sharks. And one of our goals has been to get these receivers out throughout Massachusetts waters. And we work very, very closely with beach managers, harbor masters to do that. Because many of them want to know, you know, how many white sharks come visit us, when are they here, et cetera, if they come here. And so we've got over 350 of these tags out. Not all of them are active. They have an expiration date, but now most of them, because they last up to 9, 10 years, are still transmitting. So just to give you an example of what some of these data might look like, and the simplest of figures, these are the number of detections from tagged white sharks for 2022 and 2023. And you can definitely see a very distinct seasonality. You could see some subtle differences between the 2 years. So you could start to look at various environmental factors that might be driving the presence of these animals and how that might be different between the 2 years. You know, October is a really big month in 23, but it wasn't a big month for the presence of these animals in 22. But you could see that most of them are gone. I mean, they really don't arrive until late April, or making barely any indication on these figures. June is a very slow month. They start to ramp up in July. And for the most part, they're gone in December, with really most of them departing by the end of November. And so we got a very distinct seasonality. We can also plot out where these animals are occurring on a relative scale around the state. And I'd love to share this with various beach managers in all the towns, so they get a sense of relative risk. And if you manage the beaches along the outer Cape, you're thinking, wow, the number of sharks, the number of detections, much higher here relative to when you move elsewhere. You know, it starts to taper as you get into the eastern part of Cape Cod Bay, and then you move your way to the west and north, and the number of sharks are largely just driven by animals that are moving up into the Gulf of Maine. You know, for some of our sharks, this is their final destination, but for most of them, they'll hit Cape Cod like it's a Burger King on I-95, and then head up into the Gulf of Maine and go as far as Nova Scotia and the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Newfoundland. So, and they might just come right back to the Cape as well during the course of the summer. So we got many transient and some resident animals. But these are the kinds of questions we can answer and we share with the beach managers and the public relative to the presence of these animals. One of the things we started to think about over time was, you know, how can we forecast the presence of white sharks based on data collected not only by the acoustic transmitters, but also by the satellite tags that we've been deploying. So we combined the two technologies, and Megan took the lead on this, where she modeled basically the presence of these animals, looking at these two data sets, you know, the amount of time spent in shallow water. You know, a lot of beach managers were asking us, you know, how often are these sharks here? And based on her modeling approach, we determined that almost 50% of the time that when the sharks are around Cape Cod, particularly the outer Cape, they're spending in water less than 15 feet deep, you know, and when you share that with lifeguards, it gives them a different perspective in terms of the probability of there being a shark in those areas. And that's because these sharks are hunting these shallows. You know, the presence of these animals is driven by the presence of the seals. We then started thinking in terms of, because the next question coming from many of the folks out there were, you know, how many sharks are we talking about, Greg? You know, is it 10 animals that visit Cape Cod? Is it 10,000? And there's a big difference between the two, you know, in terms of public perception and public safety. And so in 2014, as part of Megan's PhD dissertation, we started conducting a mark recapture study that was spatially explicit. So it included our acoustic data as well. And this was conducted over the course of 5 field seasons, I should say, 2014, 2018. And it involved going out and conducting surveys twice a week for several months during the year while the sharks are here, and identifying individuals. Yes, we were tagging, but we were largely, and we being Megan and her crew at the Conservancy, were identifying these individual animals based on their color patterns. And you could see an example of that in the lower left-hand corner of this screen, where you could see Emma that was tagged in November 3rd, but she has very distinct color patterns. And Megan and her team generated a catalog of over 700 individuals since she started doing this in 2014. And these are the results of her modeling, which you can see spanned 15 to 2018. You could see, you know, changes in the population that occurred over this time period. And she estimated that 800 white sharks had visited, individual white sharks had visited Cape Cod from 2015 to 2018. You can see that the numbers any particular month could be as high as over 400 animals. We think that is probably an outlier, an artifact in the model, but certainly seeing over 200 animals in recent years per month off at the outer Cape is not unusual during those peak months of August, September, and October. So we're starting to get a handle on the numbers of sharks that are visiting us while generating this catalog, which is also online and available to the public. But then we had a series of events that occurred specifically in 2018 that involved shark bites on swimmers, including the death of a bodyboarder in September of 2018. I show this figure because I want to give you a historical perspective. Lower left-hand corner, lower left, you'll see the swimmer that was bitten in 1936. That was the last fatal white shark bite we had in Massachusetts, the only really recorded one, and that was off Mattapoisett, of all places. But starting in 2012, we had a swimmer bitten off of Truro, followed by kayakers whose kayak was struck by a white shark off Plymouth, followed by a paddleboarder whose board was struck off of Wellfleet, and then those two events in 2018. So on a relative scale, and although the numbers are really low, you could see the dramatic increase in the number of these interactions between white sharks and people, which I've alluded to early on. So we started thinking in terms of what can we do as scientists to try to generate information that's going to be even more helpful to beach managers. You know, are there patterns in behavior that we can find and advise the public relative to the presence of this species? You know, it really boiled down to trying to understand predatory behavior over much finer scales. And that work started in 2019. And I would like to say that this photo was taken off of Cape Cod, but it's really just to grab your attention. It's not. It's shot off South Africa. And all too often, when we think of white shark predatory behavior, we think in terms of these animals launching themselves out of the water in search of seals. And that has been demonstrated very effectively. And we can thank Shark Week for that to some extent with their Air Jaws series off South Africa. This is the way white sharks feed there. Breaching behavior is really uncommon in Cape Cod because we're dealing with a very, very different environment. South Africa has deep water close to shore, a very specific focal area these animals are feeding, where that deep water abuts where these seals are leaving at a small island. Cape Cod has large numbers of seals broadly spread out from Provincetown to the southern tip of Monomoy, largely in shallow areas with shifting sandbars, turbid water. You got surf zones and you've got high currents. And so it's a much different, very challenging environment. Here you could see on the right, a white shark keeping its distance from the shallows, but wanting to hunt those seals, which are smart. They're staying in areas that the shark can't get into. And so our goal is really to look at, you know, this fine scale predatory behavior. And some of that involves just being in the right place at the right time. You know, this is a white shark that killed a small gray seal not far from where we were working one day. And our spotter pilot saw the blood in the water and called us over. And so what we try to do during these events is collect as much information as we can. And over the course of time, we have documented 57 such events, some of them reported to us by the public, others that we observed. And typically we only observe them after the fact. So we don't know, you know, the entire sequence of the predatory event, but we can generate information about these events. And so here you can see that it appears that most of them occur fairly close to shore. In addition to the fact we can look at the month in which these things are these events are happening, temperature, depth, you know, individual sharks, size, in addition to the time of day. And a couple of things that jump out at me is they typically happen in relatively shallow water, and basically between 10 a.m. and 2 in the afternoon. But anyone looking at this is going to say, wait a minute, Greg, this is an incredibly biased data set. You know, these are visual observations by either you, your team, the spotter pilot, or people on the beach. And these are the times you're most likely to be out there, and these are the locations you're most likely to be in. And so, you know, I'd love to publish the results of this and say, this is how white sharks hunt and these are the conditions, but I'd be doing so, I probably would not get it through the peer review process because of the bias associated with this data set. So we need to look at other indirect methods for examining fine scale behavior. And one of those is through a partnership with the Center for Coastal Studies, and specifically Brian Laguerre, who's a PhD student through UMass Amherst and the Intercampus Graduate School. And what he's done is he's set up a network of fine scale arrays. And you can see the fine scale arrays demonstrated on the left here from Herring Cove down south all the way to Nauset. Fine scale arrays are those in which we have acoustic receivers so close together that we can pinpoint and triangulate the exact position of a tagged shark as it moves through that array. And what Brian has done is he's also mapped each one of these individual areas in terms of the oceanographic conditions, and ranging from bathymetry to currents to water temperature, you name it. So we're modeling how the animal, when it moves through these very specific areas, interacts with the habitat, how it uses it perhaps to its advantage when it comes to predation. And so this animation here is some of Brian's results to date. Each one of those black dots represents an acoustic receiver. And this is a white shark that swam through the acoustic array up at Head of the Meadow Beach in Truro. And what you could see in this particular beach configuration is a dual sandbar system, which is typical of many parts of Cape Cod. You got the nearshore sandbar in addition to the offshore sandbar with a deep trough in between. And I think what jumps out at us here is that this particular shark is staying in that deep trough. And it makes perfect sense because these are ambush predators. They rely heavily on ambushing their prey with speed and stealth. And so any seal coming off that first sandbar and heading out to feed is likely could be ambushed by that shark who's placing himself in a perfect area in order to be not detected by that seal. If the seal sees the shark, generally the seal wins. All right, the seal is much more agile, it's smarter, it's got great vision, and the shark simply can't adapt to the evasive maneuvers of the seal itself. So ambush is what it's all about. So when I sit down with beach managers, and again, lifeguards, and we do this fairly routinely, I explain to them, know what your beach looks like. Know what it looks like at low tide versus high tide, know where those deep areas are. This ambush predator is more likely to be there. And the goal being producing information that can enhance public safety. So that's one method we use to observe behavior. Another tag technology, and I'll start to close things out here, is one we've been using since 2019. We've deployed 40 of these configurations on white sharks. This is an acoustic tag, not an acoustic tag, I'm sorry, an acceleration data logging tag that will have sensors built into it to record exactly what the animal is doing multiple times per second. Some of the parameters we're measuring, including acceleration, are measured 20 times per second. This is a great example of a white shark that's actually doing very little. It's a new behavior we didn't anticipate seeing. It's a white shark that's not going anywhere. It's just oriented into the current and staying in the same general area. So we can look at the data collected by the sensors to try to find behavioral states that differ, and then look at video collected by a built-in camera system to know what those behavioral states actually are. Is it acceleration for predation? Is it a breaching event? Is it resting close to the bottom? What are these behavioral states? And we don't have to be there. The tag does all the work for us. So I'm going to give you a couple of really cool examples of what we've seen. I think last year I might have showed you a predatory event. This next one I'm going to show you is a white shark that's moved off their nearshore beaches of Cape Cod out into a little deeper water, and it's actually feeding on spiny dogfish. So it's gonna be hard to see because it's a tethered tag, and if I really slowed it down, you'd probably be able to, I'll show you in a second what it looks like with a white shark has the spiny dog in its mouth, but it's moving along the bottom, and every time it accelerates, you'll see the tag go crazy. But if you look toward the mouth, every now and then you'll see a squirming dogfish. The shark is feeding on these dogfish in the deeper areas off of Chatham. And I think that is another source of food. We tend to focus on the seals, but there's a dogfish tail coming out of the mouth of that shark. This shark is affectionately known as Snoop Dogg. And here's a screen grab from that video showing the demise of one of these small dogfish in the mouth of a white shark. So they don't exclusively feed on seals. They'll move out into deeper water, and I think they do target smaller sharks like dogs. I love this video. I've only shown it once before. It is a white shark breaching event, and I'm going to show you it in real time, and then I'm going to slow it down for you. But it's something we captured this past season of our field work. We deployed 10 of these tags. But here's the shark jumping completely out of the water and doing a flip. Happens really fast. But what I'm going to do is slow it down and show you what that looks like. Give you a sense of what it's like to ride the back of a shark as it leaps its 2,000-pound body out of the water. Broad strokes of its tail, great momentum, out of the water, complete flip. You can see the acoustic tag on that shark. And then we do see these breaching events, not very frequently. This particular shark did breach a lot. So in the interest of full disclosure, I think this shark was trying to shake the tag. Most sharks do not breach. This one did. And sometimes we do see them going after something at the surface, and that results in a breach, but that only happens typically in deep water. What's really cool about these tags is once we've got those data sets back, we can generate behavioral information about the three-dimensional movements of these sharks. So in essence, it gives us the opportunity to collect behavioral information in places and at times of day when we're not out there. The direct observations are great, but I'm trying to remove that bias associated with them, find out what these animals are doing at night and in other times of day. And so I'm going to close it out with 3 slides to give you a sense of how we've been able to advance the science on white sharks here in Massachusetts, but really on the scale of the Western North Atlantic Ocean. This is Frank Carey's original track in 1979, a 3-day glimpse into the biology of this animal that was a landmark paper. Let's go back to Jack Casey and Wes Pratt in 1985, along with Toby Curtis and others, summarizing what we knew about the presence of this animal based on largely fisheries-dependent data. And then let's move to our current year and show you what we've learned using fisheries-independent data sets on the true distribution of these animals. Yes, they are largely associated with the continental shelf from the eastern Gulf of Mexico to Newfoundland. There's also this offshore component to their behavior that is really interesting that we did not anticipate. And that's demonstrates that these sharks move down to mesopelagic depths when they're out in these oceanic habitat. And what they're doing, we have no idea. But now we've taken 600 data points and turned them into, with the newer techniques, well over 1 million using the multiple technologies. For those folks who are interested in seeing some of these data, the Conservancy has posted them. A lot of our acoustic detection data are up on the White Shark logbook at atlanticwhiteshark.org. The catalog is certainly up there with over 700 individuals. And the Sharktivity app is available as well, where we put a lot of our data, all of our acoustic data at the end of the season, in addition to our real-time satellite linkages, as well as reports from the general public on sightings. And so with that, I want to thank the Conservancy and other various foundations and individuals, and including a couple of production companies over the years and that have helped us out in funding this research. And if we have time, Gary, I'll gladly take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we got about 8 minutes for questions. So you can either unmute yourself and just ask the question, or you can put something in the chat and I'll read it. So questions for Greg.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you do much research in other species of sharks that are possibly moving into New England waters? I've heard that sand tigers are becoming more prevalent around Maine.
Yeah, I mean, historically, sand tigers have occurred in the Gulf of Maine, and working with one of my students at the time, he now works for the aquarium, Jeff Kneebone, we did a multi-year study on sand tigers in Plymouth, Kingston, Duxbury Bay, which I'm happy to share with you. We work with the aquarium as well in collaborating on work with the sandbar sharks. We are seeing larger numbers of sandbars and duskies in recent years. I think that's a sign of populations coming back as a result of conservation and protections put in place. But we're keeping our eyes open, and so far nothing all that riveting in terms of distribution shifts, although I'm getting rumors of sandbar sharks moving up into the Gulf of Maine, which would be fairly unusual.
All right, thank you.
Ray Kane.
You there, Ray? I'm not hearing you, Ray.
Yeah, I'm not hearing them either.
No.
No. I hear like a cat.
There's like a cat there, Ray. Ray, you speaking a different language these days? What's going on? Oh, I lost you, Ray.
All right, next, anyone else? Question?
Making it easy on me, Gary.
Chat. Oh, Shasta Slade asked, is there a need for volunteers?
Yeah, as you can imagine, I get a lot of calls for that. You know, if we're kind of at capacity, but it doesn't hurt to reach out to me, and we could talk about it. You know, I suggest reaching out to the Conservancy as well, but yeah, we definitely don't be shy.
And Shelby also asked, do you do any internships?
Well, we have done internships. They're unpaid. The Conservancy also brings on several interns in the summer. But again, reach out to me, and we can talk about it.
Other questions? Still got 4 minutes.
Here's one. Is it true? Ray's asking about juvenile sharks in the bay. Yeah, over the last several years, we've had a number of reports of smaller white sharks in Cape Cod Bay. And that's real. We went out there and did a few trips in Cape Cod Bay. We saw smaller sharks. They're depredating on striped bass caught by charter captains and private vessels in the bay. We also do see the larger ones. So they're not exclusively small juveniles. But you know, there are larger ones there as well that move back and forth between the bay and the outer Cape. Another one here, where they give birth. That's a great question. Nobody knows where they give birth. It has been demonstrated, though, and Ray, your question, this will answer that the southern shore of Long Island is the nursery for white sharks, but in sharks doesn't mean it's necessarily where they're born. I think they're probably born on the edge of the shelf, and the young ones move in. But that's one of those great questions out there for actually the global white shark populations. Any studies planned for the future? Yeah, we're going to wrap up this behavioral work and see where it takes us. And we're going to focus a little bit more on Cape Cod Bay, I believe, this coming summer. You know, when it comes, what are the future plans for research you'd most like to conduct? You know, I'm super interested in the natural history of this animal, knowing more about its reproductive biology. And so, and also social interactions. What we see developing on the outer Cape, or has developed, is there evidence, perhaps some evidence, of a social hierarchy as well as territoriality. And so I'd like to look a little bit further into that, perhaps using some of the newer VEMCO transmitting tags that allow for small receivers to be put on the sharks in addition to the tags. So definitely going down that road, but yeah, we'll see where it takes us. I want to wrap up this behavioral work first. Do we expect the seal population in the area to start to decline, and then the white shark population? I think they're correlated, absolutely. A lot of questions we get regarding climate change, and we're working really closely with our Canadian counterparts. We've had thousands of detections throughout Canadian waters, and we have a paper now in review that looks at changes in the white shark population up in Canada. And so I'm very much interested in the effects of climate change on white sharks, and whether we're going to see any influence on the seal population as well. I think the occurrence of both these species is temperature mediated. And so I think the sharks are most likely to follow the seals. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Oh, Matt Davis up in Maine. Do we think Cape Cod's gray seal population in near carrying capacity? I'm not a marine mammalogist, unfortunately, Matt. And I wish I knew more about the gray seals, but I think it's a good question that you'd be hard pressed to get an answer about. I don't know if we know. Really have a good historical index of what the gray seal population might have looked like, say, 300 years ago. It's a good question. I mean, the anecdotal reports I get from spotter pilots and fishermen is some years there's lots of seals, some years there's not a lot of seals, and one spotter pilot told me he's been seeing less and less each year. That could be in response to the top predator that's eating them. Seals are going to change their behavior in response to that. And by all accounts, many of the sharks we're seeing too are the same individuals over and over. I mean, we tagged 20 plus individuals last year. The hard part for us was finding individuals that had not been tagged, but most of them were already in our catalog. But a good question and one certainly worth paying attention to, Matt. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Greg.
You're welcome. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, it was a great talk.
Appreciate it.
So everyone, thanks for coming. Next week, I'll send out an announcement on Friday. Mark Russo of our Habitat program will be giving a presentation on what I do not know yet. He hasn't sent me his title, but hope to see you there. So thanks everyone for coming.